Welcome in, everyone. Ready to dive into a story that's captivated folks for, well, decades.
Sounds intriguing. I'm ready when you are.
All right, so we're taking a deep dive into the case of Betty Broderick. This is the woman you might remember whose life took this dark turn that ended with her killing two people back in '89.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember hearing about this. It was a big deal, right?
Huge. It was everywhere. And we've got some excerpts here that lay out her side of things, her perspective, and they're just fascinating. I mean, really tragic, obviously, but fascinating. And that's what we're going to try to figure out today. What brings someone to that point? To murder, especially someone they were once in love with.
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? What pushes someone that far?
Right. So let's start with Betty and Dan Broderick. Picture this seemingly happy couple, 4 kids, living the California dream in San Diego. But like with so many things, right? There were cracks under the surface.
I bet. Things are rarely as perfect as they seem, right?
Never. So Dan, he's a lawyer, and his career starts to take off, becomes super successful.
Which, you can imagine, yeah, puts a lot of strain on any relationship. The pressure, the demands on his time, all that.
Exactly. And while he's building this empire, Betty's home raising their 4 kids. This is the late 60s, early 70s, so, being a homemaker was kind of the expected thing for women then.
Oh, absolutely. Totally different world back then. Hard to even imagine now sometimes.
Do you think that those expectations played a role in how Betty might have felt? About Dan's success, I mean.
I think it definitely played a part. Imagine feeling like your contributions are invisible, especially when society's putting so much emphasis on the man's career.
Yeah.
It's a huge contrast to today, that's for sure.
Makes you think, huh? How different things are now. But anyway, speaking of societal shifts, let's talk about the thing that really blew the Broderick marriage apart.
You mean the affair?
The affair. Dan had an affair with Linda Kolkena, his secretary, much younger than him.
Yeah, that was the turning point, wasn't it? And the age difference, wow, adds a whole other layer to everything.
Totally. And how we view affairs then versus now, that's a whole other conversation.
Right, social media would be having a field day with that today.
I can only imagine. Anyway, so affair leads to divorce, obviously. This is 1989. But it wasn't just any divorce, it was a battle royale.
Oh yeah, it got nasty. Especially the custody battle over the kids. Betty fought tooth and nail, felt completely cheated by the system.
And the financial side of it.
Huge disparity there. Dan's a high-powered lawyer, raking it in. Betty ends up with what she considered a pittance.
Wow. That's gotta sting. You dedicate years to supporting someone raising a family and then...
Exactly. It's a recipe for resentment, for sure.
Yeah.
Betrayal, societal pressures, financial strain, you name it.
A pressure cooker, right. And sadly, it all boiled over in the worst way.
On November 5th, 1989.
That's the day Betty shot and killed Dan and Linda in their home.
Just shocking.
Yeah.
Especially in their community. Everyone was talking about it. Love, betrayal, how far someone can go.
And the media?
Frenzy. Everyone was covering it. But the story doesn't end there. The trial in 91, that was a whole other spectacle.
So what happened at the trial? Did they paint her as, a woman scorned? Or was there more to it?
Well, there were two very different stories being told. It was woman scorned versus battered woman syndrome, a real battle.
So they argued that Betty was a victim of abuse.
That was the defense's angle. Years of emotional abuse from Dan. The affair is the breaking point, pushing her over the edge, leading to a temporary loss of control, they said.
Makes you wonder, right? How much abuse can someone take before they snap?
Exactly. Of course, the prosecution had a different take. They said it was all premeditation, a calculated act of revenge.
So 2 very different narratives, 2 very different Bettys.
And the verdict: second-degree murder for Dan, first degree for Linda.
Wow. What do you think, based on what we've heard so far?
It's tricky, isn't it? Lots to unpack there. We've got a lot more to dig into, though. We'll be looking at her life in prison, those TV adaptations, how they framed the story. There's a lot more to uncover here.
All right, I'm ready for it. This case is just, it pulls you in,
It's got everything. Love, betrayal, the dark side, human nature. It makes you question everything.
Okay, let's get into those TV portrayals then. You mentioned a movie from '92 and that Dirty John series. Did they show different sides of the story?
Oh, totally. Different perspectives, different times.
No.
The 92 movie with Meredith Baxter, it really leaned into that woman-scorned angle.
Yeah.
Portrayed Betty as, well, a bit unhinged.
I can see that. Back then, that image probably resonated with a lot of people, given the media frenzy and all. But was it accurate, do you think, or was it more for the drama?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Every story, whether it's a movie, a book, whatever, comes with its own spin. And with Betty Broderick, there were so many different versions of her truth floating around.
So we're not just looking at the facts of the case, we're looking at how those facts were twisted and turned into stories. I like it. It's like a deep dive into storytelling itself.
That's what keeps things interesting, right? The different layers, the different angles.
So what about Dirty John then? What made it different?
Well, it came out way later, 2020. And by then, our understanding of things like abuse and mental health had come a long way. Dirty John reflects that. It digs deeper into the psychological stuff.
So more nuanced. Less woman scorned, more battered wife.
Yeah, much more. They really explore how years of emotional abuse could lead to, well, a breakdown. Raises questions about whether Betty really planned it all out or just snapped.
Interesting. Amanda Peet played her. Right. Did she capture that complexity, do you think?
She nailed it. Her portrayal is way more layered. You see the darker sides of Betty, sure, but also her vulnerability, the pain, the mental health struggles, makes you empathize with her, even if you don't agree with what she did.
Powerful stuff. So time, understanding, it allows for a more, I guess, human portrayal. But does that mean what she did was okay? Can you empathize and still acknowledge how serious her crimes were?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? There's no easy answer there. And that's what makes this case so fascinating. We all have biases, right? But here, we've got to consider all the angles.
I'm ready. What else about how the media, those shows, shaped our understanding of Betty Broderick?
Well, one thing is how they fueled the debate about whether she was really guilty. The movie probably made more people see her as vengeful, you know, while Dirty John maybe softened that view.
Like we've got two Bettys, the scorned woman and the battered wife. And we have to decide for ourselves.
Exactly. But it's not just about guilt or innocence. It's about grasping how complicated her story is, what led her to those actions, what it says about society.
So this isn't just about Betty Broderick. It's about us, too.
Exactly. It's about how we understand abuse, mental health, how we respond to it all as a society.
Wow. I'm hooked. This is more than just a crime story. It's a reflection of who we are, where we've been.
That's what makes it so valuable, this deep dive. It's not just about the facts. It's about the bigger picture, the deeper questions.
All right, I'm ready to keep going. What else about Betty Broderick should we explore?
Let's get into the legal stuff now. Remember, the defense argued that Betty had battered woman syndrome.
Right, we touched on that. But to be honest, I don't know much about it. Can you break it down? What is it exactly?
Sure. Battered woman syndrome is complex. It's not just physical abuse. It's emotional, intimidation, isolation, financial control, all of it. It wears down the victim's self-esteem, makes it hard to leave.
So it's a slow, insidious thing. But how does this relate to what Betty did? Was she saying she killed them in self-defense?
That's essentially what the defense was arguing. They said years of abuse from Dan had put Betty in a constant state of fear, like she was living in a world of terror. And what she did, although extreme, was her trying to escape that.
Powerful argument. But she didn't kill him during a fight, did she? It wasn't like that. She went to his house, shot him and Linda while they slept.
Right. The defense argued that although it seemed planned out, it was actually a psychological break. Like she wasn't thinking straight, just driven by fear and desperation.
Hard to imagine, but I see what they were getting at. They were saying her mental state was the key, not some cold-blooded plan. Did they bring in experts to explain this battered woman syndrome to the jury?
Oh, absolutely. Expert testimony was key in this trial. They had psychologists, people who specialized in domestic violence, to break down the syndrome and how it could have affected Betty.
Wow, so they were introducing this whole new idea to the legal system, basically.
Exactly. It was groundbreaking. Of course, the prosecution fought back hard. They said battered woman syndrome wasn't real, should be a defense for murder.
So, a battle of the experts. It must have been a lot for the jury to handle. What made them decide the way they did, do you think?
We can only guess, really. Juries don't reveal their deliberations, but we can look at the evidence, the arguments, the media coverage to get an idea.
Media coverage, yeah. What was that like? Did people feel sorry for Betty, or did they see her as the bad guy?
It was all over the place, really. Some saw her as a victim, some as a scorned woman out for revenge, others just focused on the drama.
Just like the case itself, huh? Complicated. But do you think the media could have influenced the jury? Even a little?
Possibly. Jurors are people, right? They read the news, talk to others. Hard to completely shut that out, especially in a case this big.
So even with all the rules, outside opinions can still creep in. That's a bit worrying, isn't it? Could have made the jury biased.
It's a concern for sure. It's a balance, isn't it? Fair trial versus freedom of the press. And in Betty's case, those two things really clashed. But let's move on from the media. We've talked about both sides' arguments, but how did the court itself handle this battered woman syndrome defense? Was it a new thing for them?
Yeah, good question. Was it a well-established defense, or were they venturing into new territory?
It was pretty new, actually. Early 90s, remember, battered woman syndrome was still controversial. Some experts said it was real, could explain why a victim might use violence. Others said it was just an excuse.
So a clash between old ways of thinking and new ideas about abuse. How did that play out in the trial? Did the judge even allow them to talk about battered woman syndrome?
He did, actually, which was a big deal. It let the defense bring in experts to explain it to the jury. They argued that years of abuse had changed Betty's mind, made her hyper-aware of danger, distorted her reality.
Wow. So the judge was open to it, at least. But did the prosecution fight it?
Oh, they fought it hard.
Yeah.
Said it wasn't a real diagnosis, shouldn't be a defense at all. They brought in their own experts to say Betty was just jealous, vengeful, made a conscious choice to kill.
Another battle of the experts. Must have been hard for the jury to sort through all that. Do you think, even though Betty was convicted, this whole battered woman syndrome thing changed the legal system, even a little?
I think it did. It made people more aware of it, brought domestic abuse into the spotlight. And it made the courts start to think about how violence affects victims, how it changes them.
So her case, as tragic as it was, might have helped other women in similar situations. Like it shed light on a problem people didn't really talk about.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even the darkest stories can have a positive impact, eventually.
Makes you think. So Betty's case is more than just a crime. It's a turning point in how we understand abuse.
It's a story about society struggling with these really complex issues, challenging old beliefs, trying to find a better way.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring that. Where should we go next?
We've talked about the legal stuff, the experts, the media, but we haven't really gotten into the heart of it, have we? The emotional side of all this.
You're right. We've been focused on the facts, the arguments. But this is a human story, isn't it? Love, loss, betrayal. Those emotions can be powerful, destructive.
Exactly. To really understand Betty, we need to understand those emotions, the pain, the despair. We need to see how the abuse, the divorce, the loss of everything affected her mentally and emotionally.
It's easy to get caught up in the legal stuff, but she was a real person with real feelings. And her actions, even though terrible, came from those feelings.
And that's why this story still fascinates people, I think. It's a reminder that relationships are fragile, that betrayal hurts, that love and loss can be powerful forces.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into those deeper emotions. Where do we begin?
Let's start with Betty's relationship with Dan. Like any marriage, they had good times and bad. But there were patterns, power imbalances, things that were never resolved, things that ultimately led to the end.
So it wasn't just he cheated, she snapped. There's more to it than that.
Much more. One big thing was the power imbalance. Dan, with his career, his money, he was in control. Betty, she was the homemaker, the mom. Her own dreams took a back seat.
That was pretty common back then, wasn't it? Women putting their lives on hold for their husbands. But how did this power dynamic play out in their relationship? Was Dan mean to her, controlling?
Probably a bit of both. There are stories about him dismissing her opinions, belittling her, making decisions without her, maybe even using money to control her.
So he chipped away at her sense of self, her independence, and that's a form of abuse too, isn't it?
It is a subtle but powerful form of abuse. And how did Betty react? Well, at first she seems to have tried to play the role she was expected to. Good wife, good mom, supporting her husband. But as time went on and the imbalance grew, she started to push back.
So she wasn't just a doormat. She had her own needs, her own desires. But how did Dan react when she started standing up for herself?
Sadly, it looks like he just got more controlling. He saw her asserting herself as a threat, maybe, and instead of trying to understand, he might have used manipulation, even threats, to keep her in line.
Classic abuser behavior, right? It just keeps escalating. But in Betty's case, it seems like things got even worse when the affair happened.
Oh, absolutely. The affair was a huge blow. It was like all her fears were confirmed. That she was being replaced, discarded. It destroyed her trust in Dan, in their marriage.
It's hard to imagine the pain of that, to dedicate your life to someone only to find out they've been betraying you.
And to make things worse, Dan didn't even try to hide it. He flaunted his relationship with Linda, took her to parties, introduced her to everyone. It was like he was trying to humiliate Betty.
That's brutal, like rubbing salt in the wound. So how did Betty deal with all of this? Did she try to save the marriage?
It looks like she tried, at least at first. She confronted Dan, begged him to stop, went to counseling. But he wasn't interested. He'd made his choice, and he didn't care how much it hurt Betty.
So she was rejected on every level, her husband, her marriage, her life as she knew it. No wonder she started to lash out, trying to get back some control, some sense of power.
Exactly. And those actions, the things she did, they were often seen as crazy, unstable. But you have to remember, they came from a place of deep hurt and trauma.
So she wasn't just a scorned woman. She was a woman in pain, responding to unimaginable betrayal.
And that's something we need to keep in mind as we go deeper into her story. It's easy to judge, but we need to understand the context, the pain behind those actions.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring that. What should we focus on next?
Let's look at how all of this affected her sense of self. Remember, Betty's life revolved around being Dan's wife, raising their kids. When that was taken away, she didn't know who she was anymore.
So, more than just a marriage ending, it was an identity crisis.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And society back then didn't make things any easier. Women were judged so harshly for divorce. It was like a personal failure.
So she was trapped, wasn't she? Stuck in a system that made it hard to leave, then judged for trying to break free. And when she finally did file for divorce, it sounds like it was brutal.
Oh, it was a war. Dan used his money, his lawyers, to drag things out, make her life hell. And yeah, she made mistakes, but you can see how her actions were fueled by desperation, by the trauma she'd been through.
That she was being punished for daring to want a life of her own. It's sad, really. But her story is more than just a personal tragedy, isn't it? It reflects a bigger problem, how women were treated back then.
Absolutely. Betty's case, as unique as it is, shows how women were often silenced, marginalized, and we've made progress since then, for sure, but there's still work to be done.
Okay, I'm ready to dig into that. What should we focus on?
Let's look at how the legal system, even back then, didn't really understand domestic abuse. Remember, battered woman syndrome was a new idea. The courts were just figuring out how to deal with it.
So even though they were starting to recognize it, they weren't prepared to really protect victims.
Right. And sadly, that's still a problem today. Many women still struggle to get justice. They're afraid, they depend on their abusers financially, and the system doesn't always understand or support them.
Wow, that's disheartening. So there's hope for progress, but it's slow going. Betty Broderick's story shows how far we've come, but also how far we still need to go.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can't get complacent. We need to keep pushing for change, for a world where women are safe, supported, and empowered.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring those ideas. What should we focus on next?
Well, we've talked about the societal stuff, the legal system, but let's circle back to Betty for a minute. She's still in prison, right? Has she ever shown any remorse for what she did?
Good question. Has she admitted to anything? Apologized?
She's always maintained she's innocent, even now. She says she was a victim, pushed too far. She's given interviews, written letters, all saying the same thing.
So she's sticking to her story. Makes you wonder if she really believes it, or if it's just a way to avoid the guilt.
Who knows? It's impossible to say for sure. Maybe it's a bit of both. The human mind is a mysterious thing.
You're right. We like to think things are black and white, but real life is much more complicated. And Betty Broderick, she was both a victim and a perpetrator. Her story makes us think about those gray areas, those contradictions in human behavior.
Exactly. It's not a simple story, and there are no easy answers. It's a tragedy, a warning, a reminder that emotions can be destructive, that trauma can have lasting effects, and that sometimes the system fails to protect the people who need it most.
And yet it's a story that people are still fascinated by. Why do you think that is? What is it about Betty Broderick that keeps drawing us in?
I think it's because her story touches on things we can all relate to. Love, betrayal, wanting revenge. And it's a story that could happen to anyone. It makes us think about our own vulnerabilities, our own dark sides.
And it raises questions about marriage, divorce, how society treats women, how the legal system works. Big, uncomfortable questions.
Maybe it also reminds us that we're all capable of good and bad. That the line between love and hate, sanity and madness, can be blurry sometimes.
It's a chilling thought that even in seemingly normal lives, darkness can be lurking underneath, waiting to come out.
Well said. Betty's story is a mirror, reflecting all the complicated parts of being human. The good, the bad, everything in between.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of sadness, but also a sense of awe at how complex people can be. Betty Broderick's story isn't easy to digest, and it definitely doesn't have a neat ending. But it makes us think, it makes us question things, and I think that's valuable.
I agree. It's a journey into the darkness of the human heart. But it's also a reminder that we're all connected, that we need to understand each other, to have compassion, even when it's hard.
And on that note, I think we'll pause here. To our listeners, keep thinking about this case, dig deeper if you're interested, and come to your own conclusions about Betty Broderick. It's a story that stays with you, that makes you reflect and debate. Thanks for joining us on this journey. All right, so last time we left off talking about how the legal system was just starting to understand the whole battered woman syndrome thing.
Yeah, it was new territory for everyone.
Right. So Betty's case was kind of a test, in a way, for how the courts would handle this new idea. But how did it actually play out in the courtroom? What were the strategies each side used?
Well, the prosecution, their goal was pretty straightforward. They wanted to lay out a timeline, show that Betty planned everything out.
Makes sense. They focused on the gun, the threats, the harassment, right, to make it look like she'd been wanting to kill them for a while.
Exactly. Trying to establish a pattern, prove she was capable of thinking it through, planning it all out.
So what did the defense do? Did they try to dismantle that timeline? Or come up with different explanations for the evidence?
Oh, they did. They challenged everything the prosecution presented, like the gun, for instance. They argued Betty bought it out of fear, not malice, said she was afraid of Dan, that he had been abusive, threatening.
So they flipped the script, basically, from premeditation to self-defense. Did they do that with the other stuff, too? The threats, the harassment?
Absolutely. They said it was all a symptom of her mental state, not some calculated plan. They talked about the psychological damage from the abuse, how it messed her up.
So they were bringing mental health into the equation, saying she wasn't fully in control of her actions. Was that even a thing back then, using mental illness as a defense?
It was starting to be, but it was still pretty new and controversial. And that's what makes Betty's case so important. It was pushing the boundaries of how the legal system viewed these things.
So they were venturing into uncharted waters, kind of. But how did the jury react to all of this? Did they buy the defense's arguments?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm.
We don't know for sure what went on in that jury room, but based on the verdict, it seems like they weren't completely convinced.
Yeah, she sound delty. Makes you wonder what swayed them, what arguments they found most convincing. Any clues?
Sadly, jury deliberations are secret. So all we can do is look at what we know, the evidence, the arguments, and try to piece it together.
Speaking of piecing things together, what about the media? How did they portray Betty? Were people sympathetic, or did they see her as a monster?
It was a mixed bag, really. Some outlets played up the victim angle, the abused wife pushed too far. Others went with the scorned woman, the vengeful ex.
Yeah.
And then some just focused on the drama, the scandal.
Sounds like the media was as confused as everyone else. No easy answers, no clear good guys or bad guys. But do you think all that coverage could have affected the jury?
It's possible. Jurors are just people, and they're exposed to all of that.
Yeah.
It's hard to completely ignore what you see and hear in the news, even if you're trying to be impartial.
So even with all the rules and instructions, outside opinions can still seep in. A little unsettling, isn't it? Makes you wonder how fair any trial can really be, especially a high-profile one like this.
It's a valid concern. The justice system tries to keep things fair, but it's not perfect. But let's move away from the media for a bit. We've talked about the arguments, the coverage, but what about the court itself? How did they handle this whole battered woman syndrome thing? Was it a new idea for them? Very new. Back in the early 90s, it was still pretty controversial. Some legal experts thought it was a legitimate psychological condition, a real explanation for why an abused woman might resort to violence. But others dismissed it as a made-up excuse.
So the court was walking a tightrope, kind of, between these old ideas about crime and punishment and this new understanding of abuse and its effects. How did that tension play out in Betty's trial? Did they let the defense even talk about battered woman syndrome?
They did, actually. The judge allowed expert testimony on it, which was a pretty big deal. It gave the defense a chance to explain the science, the psychology, to the jury. They brought in experts on domestic violence to talk about how it affects the mind, how it can warp a person's perception of reality.
So the judge was open to hearing it, at least. But what about the prosecution? Did they just accept that?
Oh no, they fought back hard. They argued that battered woman syndrome wasn't a real diagnosis, that it shouldn't be a get-out-of-jail-free card for murder. They brought in their own experts to try to discredit the defense's arguments, to say that Betty was just a jealous, vengeful woman who knew exactly what she was doing.
So it was a back and forth, a battle of the experts. Must have been a lot for the jury to process. Do you think, even though Betty was convicted, that introducing this battered woman syndrome into the trial had a bigger impact, like on the legal system or even society as a whole?
I think it did, definitely. Betty's case, tragic as it was, helped raise awareness of this issue. It forced people to start thinking about the effects of abuse, the psychological toll it takes. And maybe, in a way, it paved the way for future cases where this defense was used more successfully.
So even though she lost her case, she might have helped other women in similar situations. It's like her story, as dark as it is, helped shine a light on a problem that had been hidden for too long.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest stories, there can be a glimmer of hope, a seed of change that can grow into something positive.
That's a good thought. So Betty's case is more than just a crime. It's a turning point in how we understand abuse, how we think about victims.
It's a story about society evolving, challenging old ideas, trying to find a more just and compassionate way forward.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring that evolution. What should we focus on next?
Well, we've covered the legal stuff, the experts, the media, but we haven't really gone to the core of it, have we? Betty's emotional state. Remember, her actions, terrible as they were, came from a place of intense emotion. She felt betrayed, abandoned, wronged by the man she loved.
It's true. We've been so focused on the facts, the arguments, that we've forgotten about the human element.
To really understand Betty, we need to understand those emotions, the pain, the despair, the rage. We need to see how the abuse, the divorce, the loss of everything affected her psychologically.
We need to see her as a person, not just a defendant. A person who was hurting, who made terrible choices, but who was driven by those feelings.
And that's why this story continues to fascinate people, I think. It's a reminder of the power of emotions, how they can drive us to do things we never thought possible. It's a story of the dark side of love, the destructive potential of betrayal.
Okay, I'm ready to explore that dark side. Where do we begin?
Let's go back to the beginning, to Betty's relationship with Dan. Like any marriage, it had its ups and downs. But there were also deeper issues, patterns of behavior, things that were never addressed, that festered over time.
So it wasn't just a sudden explosion, a crime of passion. There was a buildup, a history that led to this.
Exactly. One of the big things was the power dynamic. Dan, with his success, his money, he held all the cards. Betty was the homemaker, the mother. Her own ambitions were put aside.
That was pretty common back then, unfortunately. Women were expected to sacrifice for their husbands, their families, but how did that power dynamic play out in their relationship? Was Dan controlling, abusive?
It's likely there was a mix of both. There are stories of him being dismissive of her opinions, belittling her, making decisions without her input, maybe even using money as a way to control her.
So it was a slow, subtle erosion of her sense of self, her agency. And that's a form of abuse too, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It can be just as damaging as physical abuse, sometimes even more so. And how did Betty react? Well, at first it seems like she tried to play the role that was expected of her, the dutiful wife, the supportive mother. But as time went on and the power imbalance grew, she started to push back, to assert her own needs.
So she wasn't just a passive victim. She had a voice, and she was starting to use it. But how did Dan respond to that? Did he try to meet her halfway, to compromise?
Sadly, it seems like he didn't. He probably saw her assertiveness as a challenge to his authority, a threat to his control. Instead of trying to work things out, he might have resorted to even more contouring tactics.
It's that classic cycle of abuse, isn't it? The abuser feels threatened, so they clamp down harder, which only leads to more resentment and resistance from the victim. But in Betty's case, it seems like that cycle was made even worse by Dan's affair.
Oh, absolutely. The affair was like a bomb going off in their marriage. It confirmed all of Betty's fears, her sense that she was being replaced, discarded. It destroyed whatever trust was left.
It's hard to imagine the pain of that. To dedicate your life to someone, only to find out they've been living a lie, that they've found someone else to fulfill their needs. It's a complete rejection on every level.
And to make it even worse, Dan wasn't discreet about it. He flaunted his relationship with Linda. He paraded her around. It was a public humiliation for Betty, a constant reminder of her husband's betrayal.
It's like he was intentionally trying to hurt her, to rub it in her face. That kind of emotional cruelty can be devastating. But how did Betty cope with all of this? Did she try to fight for the marriage, or did she give up?
It seems like she tried to salvage it, at least at first. She confronted Dan, pleaded with him to end the affair. She might have even gone to counseling, hoping to repair the damage. But it was all for nothing.
So she was left with nothing. Her husband didn't want her. Her life was falling apart. Her identity was shattered. It's no wonder she started to lash out, to look for any way to express her rage and pain.
Exactly. And her actions, the things she did, they were often seen as signs of instability, of craziness. But you have to remember, they came from a place of deep trauma.
So we need to look beyond those labels, those judgments, and see the pain behind them. She wasn't just a scorned woman. She was a woman who had been deeply wounded, who was desperately trying to cope with overwhelming emotions.
And that's crucial to understanding her story. We can't just focus on the crime. We have to understand the person behind it, the pain that led her to that point.
Okay, I'm starting to see a more complete picture of Betty now, a more human picture. And I think that's important, to see her as a person, not just a character in a true crime story.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating, so compelling. It's a reminder that even in the most extreme cases, there's always a human story behind it. A story of pain, of loss, of choices made and consequences faced.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring that story. What should we focus on next?
Let's talk about how the affair and the divorce affected Betty's sense of self. Remember, she dedicated her life to being Dan's wife, to raising their children. That was her identity, her purpose. And when that was ripped away, she was left with nothing.
That was more than just a broken heart. It was like her whole world was shattered.
Exactly. And back then, society didn't make it any easier. Divorce, especially for women, was seen as a failure, a personal failing.
So she was trapped, expected to stay in a bad situation, then judged for trying to escape it. And when she finally did file for divorce, it sounds like it was a nightmare.
It was brutal. Dan used his money and his lawyers to make her life hell. He dragged things out, tried to paint her as unstable, vindictive, and while she made mistakes, you can see how her actions were fueled by desperation.
Like she was being punished for daring to stand up for herself, for wanting something more. It's heartbreaking, really. But her story, as personal as it is, also reflects a bigger problem, doesn't it? How women were treated back then, the expectations, the double standards.
Absolutely. Betty's case, tragic as it is, shines a light on those systemic issues. The way women were often silenced, marginalized, controlled. And while we've made progress since then, those issues haven't gone away completely.
So her story is still relevant today. It's a reminder that we have to keep fighting for equality, for a world where women are safe, respected, and empowered.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so important. It's not just about looking at the past. It's about understanding how it connects to the present, how it informs the future.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring those connections. What should we focus on next?
Let's dive into the legal system itself, how it handled domestic abuse cases, how it viewed women like Betty. Remember, back then, battered woman syndrome was a new concept. The courts were just starting to wrap their heads around it.
So even though they were acknowledging it, they weren't necessarily equipped to deal with it effectively, to protect victims.
Right, and that's still a challenge today. Many women still face obstacles when trying to get justice. They're afraid to speak out. They depend on their abusers financially. And the system doesn't always understand the dynamics of abuse, the complex psychological effects.
It's a reminder that change takes time, that we have to keep pushing for better laws, better resources, better support for victims. But what can we do as individuals to help? What steps can we take to make a difference?
Well, there are many ways to get involved. There are organizations dedicated to supporting victims of domestic abuse, to advocating for legal reforms, and to educating the public about the signs of abuse and how to intervene safely.
So it's about awareness, about education, about taking action. Betty Broderick's story, tragic as it is, can be a catalyst for change. It can inspire us to get involved, to speak out, to make a difference in the lives of those who are suffering.
Exactly. It's about turning tragedy into a force for good, about using her story to create a world where women are safe, empowered, and free from abuse. A world where stories like Betty's become relics of the past, not warnings for the future.
So we've talked about the societal pressures, the legal system, how they both kind of failed Betty in a way. But let's bring it back to her. She's still in prison, right? Serving a life sentence. Has she ever, expressed any remorse for what she did?
That's the question, isn't it? People have been wondering about that for years. And the answer is, not really. She's always maintained her innocence.
Wow. Even now, after all this time.
Yep. Still claims she's the victim, says she was pushed to the edge, that Dan's abuse and manipulation drove her to it.
It's a powerful story, no doubt.
Yeah.
And it's definitely kept people debating about whether she was truly guilty or not. But do you think she really believes that? Or is it just a way to, protect herself, avoid facing the reality of what she did?
It's hard to say. Honestly, the human mind is a tricky thing. Maybe she's convinced herself it's true, or maybe she's burying the guilt so deep she can't even access it. Probably a bit of both.
That's the thing with this case, isn't it? It's never black and white. There are so many layers, so many contradictions.
Exactly. Betty was both a victim and a perpetrator. She suffered, but she also caused suffering. And it's a challenge to hold both of those truths at the same time, to acknowledge the complexity without simplifying it.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, and yet people are still drawn to her story all these years later. Why is that, do you think? What keeps us coming back to Betty Broderick?
I think it's because it taps into something universal, something primal. The themes of love, betrayal, revenge, they're timeless. And it's a story that could happen to anyone. It makes us question our own relationships, our own choices, our own capacity for darkness.
It also forces us to look at the systems that failed her. The legal system, societal expectations, the whole idea of marriage and divorce. It makes us ask some hard questions about how we treat each other, how we define justice, how we protect the vulnerable.
And maybe, at its core, it's a story about mortality, about the fleeting nature of happiness, the potential for both great love and great destruction that exists within us all.
It's a reminder that things aren't always what they seem, that darkness can hide in the most unexpected places, even within ourselves.
Beautifully put. Betty Broderick's story is like a dark mirror, reflecting the complexities of human nature, the fragility of our relationships, and the enduring power of love, loss, and the search for meaning, even in the face of tragedy.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a mix of emotions, sadness for sure, but also a sense of gratitude for the opportunity to explore such a complex and thought-provoking case.
I agree. It's been a journey, a descent into the darkest corners of the human heart. But it's also been a reminder of our shared humanity, our capacity for both compassion and cruelty. And ultimately, it's a call to action, a challenge to create a world where stories like Betty's become the exception, not the rule.
And on that note, I think we'll leave it there. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to make the world a more just and compassionate place.